Hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking about the poetry of Sugawara no Michizane, who was a court poet of the Japanese Heian period. Michizane himself lived from 845 to 903, which was reasonably early in the Heian period, which itself stretched from 794 to 1185. But Michizane was one of the most important and influential of the court poets, and court poetry was a huge deal in the Heian court. Essentially, these were poets who served the court, served particularly the rulers, the daimyos, or the nobility, and their job combined writing sort of praise poems where you would celebrate your patron, along with incidental poems where you would record a particular event or things like this, but also just general poetry in general, like to be inspired by traditional poetic topics. And this was actually one of the things Michizane was really, really good at, because he was trained in what's called Chinese-style poetry, which is a very traditional form drawing on older Chinese forms. And it's characterized by things like variations on set topics. So particular ideas, often about nature or about human relationships, finding meaning in the aesthetic, things like these. Particular set topics. Court poets were expected to be able to produce variations on these. It was a virtuoso type of genre. And then couplets. These poems were often very short, and you'll see that when I read a couple of Michizane's poems. They were often very short, and really driven by these set metrical patterns, which don't necessarily translate well into the English versions. But one of the things that I think is really, really, really amazing about Sugawara no Michizane is that he had an up and down political career. Like, there were times he rose to the absolute heights of greatness, and there were times he was exiled. But shortly after his death, he did die in exile, unfortunately. But, and by the way, I'm reading this out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. So as with all of the things out of the Norton Anthology, there's only a small selection of his poetry here. But the introduction to Michizane explains here, the passing of the man Michizane was the birth of the god Tenjin. Some 20 years after his death, natural disasters and other inauspicious events at court were attributed to the wrath of his vengeful spirit. His reputation was rehabilitated, and shrines to him in the guise of Tenjin were built to pacify the exiled poet's spirit. Today he is revered at thousands of shrines throughout Japan as the god of scholarship and a divine helping hand to students praying for academic success in the challenging university entrance exams. And actually, here in the Norton Anthology, they have I think this is a 19th century portrait of Tenjin. So, pretty cool. Like, not that many poets are good enough and revered enough and important enough that they become gods after their death. But Sugawara no Michizane did it. So, fair play to you. So a couple of things really stand out about Michizane's poetry. One is, again, this idea of variations on specific forms. Michizane loves plum blossoms. Sorry, that's one of the images that shows up throughout his career. And we can see this in his earliest poem and his latest poems. So we get here a poem written when he was 11. It's called On Looking at plum blossoms on a moonlit night. I'm going to need to be able to pronounce that phrase to read these things poetically. And there's a little introduction here, because this was collected up. He collected up, Michizane collected up his poems into a book in 900, about 3 years before he died. And he presented it to the Emperor Daigo, along with the poems of his father and grandfather, who had themselves been court poets. And that's important as well for another one of the poems here. But with the note on looking at plum blossoms on a moonlit night, he says, written when I was in my 11th year. My father had scholar Shimida test me. That's when I composed my first Chinese-style poem. Thus I include it at the beginning of my collection. The poem goes like this. Moon glistens on snow under brightened skies. Plum blossoms seem like radiant stars. Just lovely, this golden mirror turning, and in the courtyard the perfume of their jade calces. So again, these are very short, these are very imagistic poems, and we see this a lot with Buddhist poetry, we see this with Sanskrit poetry, we see this with a lot of Asian traditions. Zen poetry, haiku in Japan these are often very imagistic poems in which these particular images or particular forms, particular ideas are loaded with emotional resonances. And so in this case, we've got perfume, we've got golden mirror, we've got plum blossoms like radiant stars, the moon like snow. So everything is descriptive, everything is sensory detail. And this is, again, this is the way that these poems tend to run, is on an economy of images that convey to us significant emotional connections. They tell us about the world that the poet experiences, or the poet persona, I should say. Some of the last poems, I'm actually going to read to you one of his last ones, not his absolute last one, although that is included in here as well. But I think this one is a brilliant little poem. It's called Seeing the Plum Blossoms When Sentenced to Exile. And actually, according to the footnote here, it says, legend has it that the tree in his garden in Kyoto was so touched by this poem that it flew to be with him in Daizaifu, the place of exile in the south. So here it is. Seeing the plum blossoms when sentenced to exile. When the east wind blows, send me your fragrance, you plum blossoms. With your master gone, don't forget about spring. So it's beautiful, this just very compact, very concise and efficient evocation of longing, of loss, this sense of like, don't forget about spring, don't lose the beauty of life and existence just because I'm being sent into exile. Send me your fragrance to remind me of home, to help me maintain my strength in exile. It's such a short poem, but it's this amazing, beautiful sentiment. And again, this is what a lot of these poems do. They are these virtuoso type performances where you take a particular image or idea or whatever it is, and you unpack some idea, some sense, some feeling from that image. So I think it's brilliant. But the other one I want to read you out of this book is called The Hardships of Professors. Now, you might think to yourself, well, Philip is a professor. This is obviously going to be a sort of self-pitying gesture about, oh, how difficult it is to be a professor. No. I mean, yes, it is. There is that element of it. We do have not necessarily the easiest task in life, despite what many people seem to think. But The Hardships of Professors is a really, really interesting poem to me because it actually telegraphs what it's doing in a way that promotes its own ethical worldview, because it talks about how the Sugawara family have devoted themselves to Confucian studies, to Chinese studies. And as you know, if you watched my earlier video on Confucianism as a Chinese philosophy, one of the things that was central to Confucius was reverence for ancestors. He believed very, very deeply that a person had an ethical obligation to behave properly and to honor their ancestors in order to appease the spirits of their predecessors, so that those spirits could intercess on your behalf with the gods. So here we have the hardships of professors. My family is not one of generals. With Confucian studies we make our living. My venerable grandfather reached the 3rd court rank, and my dear father served as high court noble. They understood the power of studying the past, and bequeathed it for their descendants' glory. The day I was promoted to the status of advanced student, and that, by the way, is a particular rank within the sort of education system of Heian, Japan, I eagerly wished to establish myself in our family trade. The year I became professor at the State Academy, luckily our lecture hall was rebuilt. Everybody rushed to extend their congratulations. Only my father was startled. Why was he so startled? Unfortunately, you are our only child. Certainly the official rank of a professor is not bad, and a scholar's salary is decent. But I once also held this post and learnt to be cautious, afraid of human emotions. When I first heard his kind advice, I felt as if stepping on ice, unsure how to proceed. In my 4th year, the council decided to have me teach all students. So this is explained here in a footnote. During Michizane's first 3 years as a professor, the lectures were given by his senior colleague, whose death gave Michizane the opportunity to lecture. In my 4th year, the council decided to have me teach all students. Hardly had I been at the lectern for 3 days when slanderous rumors reached my ears. This year, when recommending students for advancement, the criteria for pass and fail were real clear. But the first talentless student who failed badmouthed me and filed a complaint, demanding unearned promotion. In my teaching there are no shortcomings, and in my selection for advancement I was fair. How true my father's advice when he warned me before all this happened. So the commentary on the education system I think is really, really interesting. I don't know enough about Heian period Japanese education to really have a good sense of it, but I'm really struck by lines 2 through 6, where Michizane says, "With Confucian studies we make our living. My venerable grandfather reached the 3rd court rank, and my dear father served as high court noble. They understood the power of studying the past and bequeathed it for their descendants' glory." This really sort of encapsulates the Confucian ethic of ancestor honoring. I mean, he specifically mentions his grandfather and his father. He specifically honors them by mentioning their successes. And then he talks about how they understood the power of studying the past and bequeathed it for their descendants' glory. He recognizes and gives credit to his ancestors, his father and grandfather, for the good service that they have done him in setting him up for his own career. And then, of course, we have this shift to the father's advice and the story about what Michizane encountered when he was teaching. And that takes us away from the idea of Confucian ancestor worship, Confucian honoring of one's father and grandfather, etc., etc. But we return in the final lines. How true my father's advice when he warned me before all this happened. So again, we have that coming back to that Confucian ethic of acknowledging one's debt to one's parents, to one's ancestors, and letting that sort of guide one's life.